The sun was starting its descent over the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter was on his way home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the stress of the day. The radio played faintly in the background, a soothing antidote to the bustling city streets. It was supposed to be just another evening, another mundane drive home, but everything was about to change. Eric approached an intersection. The light turned yellow. He slowed down, just in time for it to turn red. But before he could process the situation, the blue and red lights of a police cruiser flashed in his rearview mirror, followed by the sharp blare of a police siren. His stomach sank. It was a moment that seemed frozen in time, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. What could have been a simple evening drive was now the beginning of something entirely unexpected. He pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing, his pulse quickening. He rolled down his window, glancing at the officer walking toward him. Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest, stepped forward. His posture was stiff, exuding the kind of confidence that only years of experience could give. He was used to being in control, and it was clear he wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. "License and registration," Larson said curtly, his voice flat but filled with authority. Eric complied, reaching into his glove compartment and handing over his documents. His movements were deliberate, calm, but inside, his mind was already spinning. What had he done wrong? It wasn't speeding. He had made the right call at the light. So what was this about? Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Eric closely, his eyes scanning him as though searching for something more than just a traffic violation. The air between them seemed to grow heavier, and Eric could feel the tension building. Something was shifting in Larson's demeanor. This was no longer just about the stop. There was a different dynamic in play now. Larson glanced down at the driver's license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice now laced with something more than routine curiosity. Eric hesitated for just a moment. "I moved here a few months ago," he said, his tone even, betraying no hint of tension. "My address is on the license." Larson didn't acknowledge the answer. His eyes lingered on Eric for a moment longer than necessary. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" he asked, leaning a little closer now, his posture changing subtly, taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "Just going home," Eric replied, his voice still steady. But inside, the feeling of unease was growing. There was something more to Larson's questions. This wasn't just about a minor traffic violation. Eric could sense the change in the officer's attitude. The dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just a driver anymore. He was a suspect in Larson's eyes. Larson paused for a moment, his gaze now more intense, his posture leaning slightly toward Eric, as if he was trying to assess something deeper than just the facts of the stop. Eric could feel the shift. The tension was growing thicker, more palpable. Larson stepped back, taking the documents and folding them with exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. He seemed to relish the moment of control. Eric's eyes followed the officer's every movement. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered suddenly, his voice more commanding than before. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened involuntarily. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice still calm, but now edged with suspicion. Larson didn't hesitate. His lips twitched slightly as he responded, "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Eric exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He didn't know what was happening, but he wasn't about to give in to a baseless escalation. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements still calm, deliberate, but now his mind was fully alert. He had to keep his composure. Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up, looking for any signs of aggression, anything that would justify his suspicions. Eric stood a little taller than Larson, his broad shoulders giving an air of strength and calm, but his demeanor was far from threatening. "Hands where I can see them," Larson barked, his voice clipped. Eric complied, keeping his hands visible, but his gaze never left the officer's face. There was no fear, no anxiety, just a quiet strength, and it was beginning to unsettle Larson. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Eric asked again, his voice still steady, but with a hint of challenge. Larson's smirk faded, replaced by something sharper. "Just routine," he muttered, though the words sounded less convincing with each passing second. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful. Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. Incidents involving men in business suits, driving sedans. Or does this have more to do with something else? The question landed like a punch. Larson's expression faltered for just a moment, and Eric could see it, the officer's composure slipping. For a moment, Larson was thrown off balance, uncertain of how to proceed. Larson shifted his weight, stepping back slightly. His hand drifted toward his belt, an unconscious movement, as if seeking reassurance in the weapon at his side. But Eric wasn't backing down. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself more than Eric. "Like you know exactly how this is going to play out." Eric didn't respond right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For the first time, Larson paused, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Eric wasn't just another driver he could intimidate. This was something different. And for the first time, Larson didn't know how to respond. Eric stood tall, his posture unshaken by Larson's verbal jabs. The air between them was thick with tension. Larson was losing control, and Eric could feel it. "Listen," Larson said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric didn't rise to the bait. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And right now, I'm not seeing much of it." The words hung in the air between them, the tension crackling. Larson's composure was unraveling in front of Eric, but he didn't back down. He didn't let the officer intimidate him. Instead, Eric took control of the situation, and Larson, for the first time, felt the power slip from his hands. Eric stepped forward slightly, closing the space between them. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's eyes narrowed. "I don't care who you are," he retorted, his tone defensive, though there was a subtle crack in his voice. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, his voice never wavering. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." Larson's hand twitched near his holster, but he didn't act on it. His eyes followed Eric's every move, his attention fixed on the leather wallet that Eric pulled from his pocket. Eric slowly flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," he said casually, head of internal affairs, Sacramento division. Larson froze. His eyes darted between Eric's face and the badge now resting in Eric's open palm. For a long moment, it was as if time itself had come to a standstill. The confusion on Larson's face was palpable. He blinked, searching Eric's expression for any sign that this was some kind of joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only cold, hard authority, and a hint of disappointment that seemed to weigh heavily in the air between them. "Internal affairs?" Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly. His usual confidence seemed to drain away as the realization hit him. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This wasn't just a simple violation. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "Yes," Eric replied calmly, cutting Larson off before the officer could finish his thought. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." For the first time, Larson's confident demeanor began to crack. His hand, which had been hovering near his belt, slowly fell away, as though the weight of his own authority had become too heavy for him to carry. He took a small step back, eyes flicking to the badge and then back to Eric's face. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The officer's world was crumbling in real time, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. Eric took a small step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created. Larson seemed to shrink back slightly as Eric moved in, his eyes now wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" Eric's voice cut through the silence like a knife, calm, but with an undeniable edge. Larson's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood there, his jaw tight, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, Eric had control, and Larson had no idea how to regain it. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, his voice steady but firm. "Oh, that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation, either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to." Larson's face paled slightly, but he still didn't respond. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly at a loss. "You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights," Eric said, his gaze never leaving Larson's face. "You assumed I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" Larson's eyes narrowed. This time, he opened his mouth to speak, but his voice faltered, unable to form any coherent words. It was as though everything he had been trained to believe was unraveling before him. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Eric finished, his words sharp and final. Larson took a small, almost imperceptible step back. The weight of Eric's statement hung in the air, suffocating. For the first time, Larson seemed to understand that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. His frustration was visible now, his body tense and rigid. But his words came out haltingly, unsure of how to navigate this new reality where he wasn't the one in control. "You know what I mean?" Larson muttered, his voice low, but lacking conviction. "I didn't mean it like that." Eric tilted his head slightly, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yes, you did," he said, his voice still calm but cutting through the officer's defenses like a knife. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson stood frozen, his eyes flicking between Eric and the road. The ground beneath him was no longer solid. The world he knew, one where he could assert dominance and control without question, was slipping through his fingers. The moment was slipping away from him, and he had no idea how to regain control. Eric's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "Listen, Officer Larson," he said, stepping even closer now. "This isn't just about this stop. It's about what happens when people like you forget that respect is earned, not given simply because of the uniform you wear." For the first time, Larson looked uncomfortable. His gaze flicked down to Eric's badge again, as if it might vanish if he didn't look too closely. He swallowed hard, his earlier bravado shattered. The officer's body language now screamed uncertainty. "Now, I'm going to ask you to take a step back," Eric said, his voice firm, yet measured. "You're going to return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted as though he wanted to protest, but something in Eric's gaze made him hesitate. There was a quiet authority in the way Eric carried himself, a power that was no longer tied to a badge, but to something deeper, something Larson wasn't used to encountering. The silence stretched between them, thick and tense. Larson was clearly debating whether to push back, to try and regain control of the situation. He had no idea who he was dealing with anymore. But the hesitation was all Eric needed. It was Larson's moment to decide. And in that moment, he realized he had already lost. Eric's voice broke the silence once more. "You're going to hear from me again," he said, his tone low but unwavering. "Not as the driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Eric leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he thought about what came next. Larson wasn't the problem. He was just a small piece of the puzzle. The real issue was the culture that allowed officers like Larson to exist without fear of accountability. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said, before slipping out of the room. Eric's focus shifted back to Larson's file, but this time, it wasn't just about one officer. It was about changing a culture, about addressing the systemic problems that allowed officers like Larson to operate unchecked. The days that followed the encounter with Officer Larson felt like a blur to Eric. His mind was still preoccupied with the events of that evening. The way Larson had escalated the situation, the assumptions he had made, and the way the officer's composure unraveled before him. But Eric knew that the most important part of this whole ordeal had just begun. Larson's behavior was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue within the department. And Eric, now fully aware of the power he wielded as head of internal affairs, was determined to make a change, not just for himself, but for the entire community. He spent the next few days carefully reviewing Larson's record and conducting his own investigation into the culture within the Sacramento Police Department. What he uncovered confirmed his suspicions. Larson wasn't the only officer exhibiting these troubling behaviors. There were systemic issues in the department, issues that went far beyond a few bad apples. The problem was institutional, and Eric knew he had to address it head on. The decision was clear. Something had to change, and it had to change now. A week later, Eric found himself in a small, sterile conference room with Chief Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense attitude. The two men sat across from each other, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. Daniels had always been an ally to Eric, but this conversation was different. Eric didn't waste time. I could have written off what happened with Larson as just another bad interaction. He began, his voice steady, but there was a quiet intensity to it. But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't isolated. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do within this department. Daniels leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he listened. The lines on his face deepened with concern. This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up, he admitted, but we've always handled it internally quietly. Eric's jaw tightened. Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud, Chief. It's time to make a stand. Daniels sighed, his eyes meeting Eric's. What are you proposing? A department-wide review, Eric said firmly, without hesitation. Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping these issues under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? Daniel sat forward, his hands clasped together on the table. You're going to ruffle some feathers with this, he said, his voice tinged with caution. I know, Eric replied. It's about time someone did. The two men locked eyes for a long moment. Eric could feel the gravity of the conversation settling over them both. What he was proposing wasn't just a shift in policy. It was a challenge to the very foundation of the department. And for the first time in a long while, Eric felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt before. This was bigger than just one officer. It was about changing the system. Daniels finally nodded, his face set with determination. All right, Eric, let's make it happen. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Eric's office became a war room of sorts. As he worked tirelessly to compile data, hold interviews, and speak with officers about the department's internal culture. The Larson incident became the spark that ignited a firestorm of change. Eric led public forums, gathering feedback from the community and hearing firsthand about the issues people faced when interacting with law enforcement. He knew that the solution wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make it happen. The most difficult part of the process was facing the officers who had been a part of the system for years, those who were entrenched in the department's old ways. Some of them resisted the changes, questioning the need for transparency and accountability. But Eric stood his ground. He couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a packed room of officers, city officials, and local residents. The audience was mixed. Some were hopeful, some were skeptical, but all were listening closely to what Eric had to say. He wasn't there to point fingers or assign blame. He was there to speak of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His voice resonated through the room, calm but firm. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. Eric paused, letting his words sink in. That's the badge I believe in, he continued, his voice growing stronger. And that's the badge we're building here, together. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down from the podium, Eric glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some were skeptical, some were hopeful, but all were listening. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the possibility of a better future. A future where the badge represented something more than power. It represented accountability. As Eric drove home that evening, the sunset reflected on the windshield, casting a soft glow over the road ahead. His mind replayed the journey that had brought him to this point. The confrontation with Larson had been just the beginning. The real work, the hard work, was just getting started. But Eric was ready for it. This was more than just one case. It was about a movement for justice, for transparency, and for accountability. Eric knew that change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not for the accolades or the applause, but for the knowledge that he had made a difference. One small step at a time, he had helped reshape the system, and the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot.